Good evening. My name is Antonio Sennis, and I'm honored to be here and welcome you on behalf of UCL's History Department to this year's Aaron Graham Memorial Lecture. This lecture was established in 2024 to honor the memory of our dear colleague, Aaron Graham, who passed away in 2023, and to celebrate his outstanding contribution to the study of economic history, broadly conceived. As every year, I would like to extend a particular warm welcome to Aaron's family and friends who are with us this evening, and I believe to some of his former school teachers as well. We are delighted that you could join us. This year's lecture will be delivered by Peter Wilson, who is Chichele Professor of the History of War at the University of Oxford. After the lecture, Aaron's dad, Robert, will say a few words, and following that, you are all warmly invited to a reception in the common room of the History of Archaeology. Will follow the crowd. This lecture is a joint endeavor between UCL History and the Economic History Society. As is customary, I have the easy task of welcoming everyone. I keep the easy bit for me. The more substantial task of introducing our speaker and chairing the lectures falls to the President of the Economic History Society, Professor Patrick Wallis, who I'm delighted to welcome back to UCL this evening. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Antonio. I am Patrick Wallis. I'm the President of the Economic History Society, and every year it's a delight to be here to welcome the lecturer and introduce the speaker. I'm not entirely sure, it's probably in the crisp pursuit of productivity that we have two introductions, so I will actually keep mine rather brief. I knew Aaron, and when I knew Aaron, he was working with Peter, who's this year's speaker, as this year's lecturer, as a researcher in Oxford. So it's particularly appropriate, poignant, but also very meaningful to have Peter come to give this lecture. Peter, as Antonio said, is the Chichele Professor of the History of War. To be the Chichele Professor of History of War means that you really are the person who knows the history of war. It's no other way to kind of define that role more. His work is extraordinarily extensive on the history of the Holy Roman Empire, on the history of the 30 Years' War, and his most recent book goes even beyond that to write what he subtitles as a military history of the German-speaking peoples since 1500. It's called Iron and Blood, which I think kind of captures it even more in the main title. So Peter was someone, and I think he's going to talk about this himself, who had a really major influence on Aaron's career and his research. Aaron spent several years working with him in Oxford, when Aaron went back to Oxford, as part of a project that we're going to hear much more about on the European fiscal military system. It was something that Aaron wrote about in an edited volume on the British fiscal military state, and Aaron was working on extensively at the point he passed away. I have a feeling that Peter will tell us a great deal about the European military fiscal system in his lecture. So let me simply introduce him, hand over to our speaker this year, the Aaron Graham Memorial Lecture on early modern Europe's business of war. If I could get my words in order, it would be better. Please.
Right, well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's an honour to be here. Thank you very much, everyone, to coming out tonight. Last year's lecture was presented by Pat Hudson, who highlighted British and Caribbean economic and financial history as areas where Aaron made important contributions. And today I want to draw attention to another aspect of his work, which shows really the remarkable breadth and depth of his activities. This concerns the mobilization of human, financial and material resources for warfare and the concomitant impact on Europe's political and economic development. Aaron was one of 9 postdoctoral researchers on the project that was funded by the European Research Council and ran the funded part of the project, ran from 2018 to 2025. And as with the way of all projects, we're still writing up the findings, but the web address there gives you where you can find many of these. They're open access, and they include Aaron's publications from the project as well. But his contribution to this extended far beyond the 2 years that he worked on the project. And his 2 years there, he actually was employed for 3, but he got the job here, which I think is again testimony to the qualities that he had. Already shortly after I arrived in Oxford in October of 2015, Aaron worked with me to prepare a pilot project as a sort of feasibility study for what I was proposing to do at the time. And he then went on to secure his funded postdoctoral project at UCL. So I kind of lost him to UCL for a couple of years. That was the project that resulted in the fabulous book Tropical Leviathan. But luckily he had completed that in time to return once I had secured the funding and to be employed on the London case study for the Fiscal Military System project. This project was really very much a team effort, and I'm very pleased to acknowledge not just Aaron's input but also the other 8 postdoctoral researchers who worked on the project, our invaluable administrator, our extremely generous advisory board. We all benefited greatly, and as I think it was very much greater than the sum of its parts as a result of that. I'm talking today, the title really should be not what it's on the screen, but it should be Early Modern Europe's Business of War, and that is the main title of a forthcoming book. Hopefully this month, next month, we will deliver the typescript, which is everyone from the project, sadly not Aaron, but everyone else has contributed to this, which showcases our project hopefully for a broader audience, and that will also be fully open access. And it's really our deep regret that Aaron did not live to participate in this, but his spirit and his ideas very much animate what we're doing. So what I want to do tonight is I want to discuss the historiographical context where this project and our work has been trying to make a contribution, to outline our approach and methodology, and finally to showcase some of our findings. In doing so, I also want to emphasize Aaron's contribution to our work. We seek really to build upon rather than to overturn existing approaches. So we're not really just filling a gap and that gap is really evaluating the significance of non-indigenous resources to European states and the state system. And by non-indigenous resources, the image you can see on the screen there, these are Swiss soldiers who are fighting the French revolutionaries in 1830, an event that leads to the disbandment of the Swiss regiments in French service, and within a year, in fact, to the founding of the French Foreign Legion. So I'll come back to the importance of that slide in a little while. But what we're also trying to do is to provide an analytical framework in order to study things which are often being looked at independently and separately. And in particular, we want to build on 2 models which the literature so far has drawn upon. These, I would argue, are not mutually incompatible approaches, but in fact examine 2 sides of the same coin. So probably the best known one is the idea of a fiscal military state. That was coined by John Brewer, or at least it's publicised by John Brewer in 1989 in his book, and that highlights really institutional growth and revenue raising. And the other book, which was by Roger Knight and my former Hull colleague Martin Wilcox, is the one that popularised the term contractor state, and that focuses really much more on expenditure, so what you do with the money that you've got, and it asks really whether reliance on private contractors and by extension on market forces proves superior to nationalised or state-controlled production. But both of these focus on the state, and they tend to regard a state as striving for autarky, something which is assumed to be inherently desirable, so the idea of being self-sufficient in resource mobilization. And they primarily investigate the demand side of the equation, what the state wanted, rather than looking at how they managed to obtain what it was that what they wanted, especially how they managed to get it beyond national economies. So our hypothesis has been, and this was really something that emerged very much in my very early discussions with Aaron back in 2015, 2016, was to challenge the conventional narrative of the violent rise of the European state system by revealing how belligerent competition also required cooperation. States, in fact, were not autarkic actors engaged in some kind of Darwinian struggle or survival of the fittest. Their emergence was really codependent, and it entailed developing ways of obtaining war-making resources that were beyond their political jurisdictions, and that's my definition of foreign. It's outside your political jurisdiction. It's not a foreignness defined by culture or language or nationality or anything like that. And this is really, I would argue, the paradox of European history. Competition was only possible through cooperation with allies, neutrals, and even in some cases enemies, because states have rarely obtained whatever it was they needed from warfare for their own population. And governments, on the other side, have also rarely been able to prevent their own subjects from aiding other powers. So our approach was also to de-center the conventional historical perspective by shifting the analytical focus away from political capitals and from the sovereign state more generally, and instead to examine how fiscal military transactions ran through what we've described as urban hubs, functioning as centers of expertise and resource accumulation and production. These hubs were really the centres for third-party deals, not just places where business was conducted with the government of that city, so the higher authority. So this is why Paris, for example, doesn't feature, or Madrid. They were really hubs where you could engage with governments that were elsewhere. So you could, for example, you could go to Amsterdam and you could use that as a base on which to conduct business with Sweden or with German principalities. And we had 6 case studies, and they focused on 5 were on particular cities and 1 was on a region. The most important of these historically was Amsterdam. That was Europe's primary hub, emerging around 1580, displacing earlier centres like Antwerp, Bruges or Lyon. And it retained its pole position really until the French occupation of the city in 1795. Its importance rested on its role as Europe's entrepot, of course, as for colonial produce and other goods, but also its speedy communication and connections to the Dutch political centre of The Hague, which was also frequently used for third-party negotiations, particularly from the mid-17th to the mid-18th century. And that is also the subject of a joint essay that Aaron wrote with Jeanette Kamp, who was the original person doing the Amsterdam study, which looked at just the practicalities of getting between The Hague and Amsterdam in a day in order to conduct this type of business. Amsterdam was also well connected with Europe's main arms production centres. That included, of course, those in the Dutch Republic, but also the Bishopric of Liège, which is still a centre for arms production today. And it was connected either directly through merchants, its own merchants, or indirectly through Hamburg with the Baltic. The second study was the one that Aaron worked on, and that was on London. And London emerged relatively late as a hub after 1688, but it soon became important as a financial centre. London was unusual in that it embodied many of the key functions all in one place. It was a political capital, it was a financial centre, it was a site of production, it was a commercial, and it was a transport hub. Tragically, Aaron's untimely death robbed us of what undoubtedly would have been a very fine book on that, and I'm sure Had he lived, he would have beaten us all in print. He would have got there first. But we are extremely fortunate in having a summary which is based on phenomenal statistical work that he did of many of the key findings that would have gone into that book, and that is in the latest issue of the English Historical Review. So I really heartily commend that to you. And again, like our other project publications so far, it's open, fully open access. In this essay, he demonstrates Britain's, and I quote here, systemic dependency on foreign resources, which allowed its ministers to have their cake and eat it. Really, what he was talking about here is the relatively cheap and reliable access to external resources, and especially manpower, meant that the British government could repeatedly avoid controversial decisions such as raising taxes or offering concessions to Catholics to encourage them to serve. It was only when access to these foreign resources was disrupted in the 1790s that ministers were forced to reshape domestic resource mobilisation. And the two best examples of that are, one, the introduction of income tax in 1798, but also the concession to Irish Catholics in 1793. What you can see here is the officer's coatee of a man who served in the 71st Light Infantry during the Peninsular War. That was technically a Scottish regiment, but 34% of its personnel were actually Irish, and at least 90,000 Irish served in the British Army between 1800 and 1815, something which hadn't happened before and had been resisted because of the fear of granting concessions to Catholics. So the third centre was Vienna, which was the centre for doing business within the Holy Roman Empire and also with the Austrian Habsburgs. That was also linked to the Baltic and to the Adriatic mercantile networks. And Vienna was the place where you could also go in order to obtain transit rights and the ability to then to move personnel, for example, through the vast Holy Roman Empire. The fourth study was on Genoa, which was vital to Spain in the later 17th century, and it remained a centre for the conduct of business in the Mediterranean region until the city's loss of independence. And there's another fine essay that Aaron co-wrote with Michael Martocchio about the grain, the transport of grain, so sourcing grain to feed the British army that was fighting to back the Habsburgs in the War of Spanish Succession, and how this was sourced in North Africa, transported all the way through the Adriatic, along the Po, and then transshipped out of Genoa, and the complications of that whole process involved. And that was organised by people based in Genoa. Geneva, like Genoa, was also a place where the conduct of war business became important to the city, but also frequently endangered its neutrality. It was a key centre, particularly for France, in projecting French power beyond the Alps and also connections through into Switzerland. One of the surprising things that you wouldn't really think of, that Switzerland was actually a source of horses for the French army, and some of those come through that route as too. The last study, the sixth study, was the Baltic. We had originally planned to look at a Baltic city, but it quickly became obvious that it would be far more interesting to take advantage of the fact that the sound toll registers had been digitised. These are the registers of not all, but most ships that entered or left the Baltic from the late 15th century through to the middle of the 19th century, and these have been trawled through by one of our team, who hopefully will publish her book in fairly soon, I hope. We recognise that other cities, of course, also functioned as hubs. We haven't been exhaustive. Hamburg would have been a good study, and some temporarily served as hubs. So Lisbon, for example, had extraterritorially a British naval hospital throughout the 18th century, so well before the Napoleonic Wars. That was a key facility in what was technically neutral territory. But fiscal military transactions remained concentrated in relatively few locations, unlike more general economic, political and other business. We're looking in addition to multiple actors. So further to this shift of perspective, we wanted to look beyond the sovereign states to consider semi-sovereigns and the multitude of non-state actors, so financiers, agents, brokers and contractors of all kinds who were engaged in facilitating the transfer of war-making resources. An actor's engagement with the system varied across time and space. As one would expect, Europe's major states were, of course, the major consumers of external war-making resources, but how they did this and how they engaged with it varied considerably. And also, the type of people who were involved varied. War business was very rarely contractors' sole business. They often engaged in commercial activity as well. So Louis de Geer and his partners, who are responsible to a considerable extent for Swedish industrialization in the early 18th century, he had a virtual monopoly on the export of iron cannon from Sweden, but he also invested in the slave trade, for example. What are these resources then that I'm talking about? Well, for ease of analysis, we group these into 6 asset categories, and these are the categories that we're using, in fact, to structure the team book that hopefully will be completed shortly. The first of these were foreign military and naval personnel recruited for Europe's armies and navies. The second were individual experts who were hired for their expertise and skills. So they tended to be recruited on a rather different basis. So we separated out expertise and manpower. Information and intelligence. There were, for example, private intelligence bureaus that sold information to multiple players during the War of Spanish Succession. Exciting stuff like that. Finance is an obvious one, including loans and credit. War materials, and we looked at that expansively, so not only weaponry and munitions, but also horses, food and anything else that could be used for war, so dual use items in other words, which of course are extremely difficult to track. Lots of wood, lots of iron ore and so on transits out of the Baltic, but you don't know really what it's going to be used for, so it's quite difficult to ascertain some of this in quantity terms. And lastly, what we term facilities. So these include, for example, the right of transit across neutral territory or waters, and the use of facilities such as warehouses and ports. And this here you can see in this 18th century picture, Dutch and British ships moored in the same Mediterranean harbour. So how big is this? We had a database that we all laboured hard on and got very frustrated with, that now has more or less 1,400 or so entries. Of these, nearly 1,000 contracts were for the hire of auxiliaries or for the subsidising of external military assistance. And this is from a period from about 1530 to I think the latest one is 1864. I would estimate that is probably about 1 in 7 of all international agreements. So these type of agreements were far, far more common than, for example, commercial treaties. And these particular type of agreements are only one of 4 different types that were used for raising foreign manpower, and far more common was the direct recruitment of foreign regiments into one other power's service, so like the Swiss that I showed you at the beginning. And France made at least 480 of these agreements. The Swiss and the Irish are the best known, perhaps, foreign soldiers, but Germans were certainly more numerous. If we're going to try and quantify this, estimates vary, but between 1 and 2 million Swiss served during the main period of this foreign service, with peaks of around 80,000 or so. That's quite a lot for a population of only a million or so. Roughly a fifth of the French army were foreigners, or 1/3 of the Spanish army, and so on. These kind of statistics can be multiplied. And this is far more important than colonial manpower. So at the peak of the 7 Years' War, Britain was paying nearly 80,000 Germans, which was 4 times the number of North American provincials and militia that it had in its forces globally. finance is obviously another key aspect. Smaller states in Europe became heavily dependent on foreign subsidies. Subsidies covered around a fifth of both Sweden and Prussia's war costs during the 7 Years' War, and this became a structural dependency. Sweden is probably the best example of this. For around 90 of the 165 years between Swedish intervention in the 30 Years' War and the time of the French Revolutionary Wars, Sweden was receiving foreign subsidies, and that was just from the French. It also received British, Russian and Ottoman payments for another 18 years. Subsidies were important because they were paid in hard currency and could be used as collateral for external loans. So they're a kind of financial force multiplier, and the Swedes used that to a considerable extent. Foreign loans grew with the development of Europe's capital markets, heavy investment in Dutch, French and British debts. And again, as Aaron has calculated, he shows that the proportion of British debt held by foreigners grew in the middle of the 18th century to a peak of around a quarter, and it remained then around 10 to 20% until the 1780s. So again, the cut-off of that foreign access to foreign money is another factor that is forcing the British government to take unpleasant decisions by the time it has to fight revolutionary France. Arms imports were of course important, gunpowder especially, and its crucial ingredient saltpeter. No European state was self-sufficient in gunpowder. Prussia imported 95% of the gunpowder that it used during the 7 Years' War. Most of that was coming through Amsterdam, and a lot of it was in fact being supplied by the British. Saltpeter, and you can see here the attempts to, this is from a German engraving of the 1780s, so to try to artificially produce saltpeter was extraordinarily laborious. It took about 4 years to achieve it. Saltpeter was really the only resource that Europe was not self-sufficient in, and it was Britain's conquest of Bengal in 1757 which gave it control of around 70% of global production, which was an important strategic advantage lasting into the 19th century. So for the rest of this paper, I want to very, very briefly scoot through the time frame that we're looking at. So from the early 16th century to the later 19th century, to give something of the sense of how this all develops, and hopefully to convey something of the broader historical significance. And then I will briefly conclude by placing our findings in their global context. So how do you talk about the emergence of anything? There's always antecedents. When does any kind of historical development begin? That's always very, very difficult. Our general conclusions are that there was a single system. Ultimately, the methods of exchanging resources become standardized and they extend across Europe, and there's a recognized way of doing this. But initially, this was very disparate, and it only gradually coalesced. And it was influenced, of course, by pre-existing commercial and banking networks, as well as warfare and broader changes. One of the broader changes is the changing political balance within Europe, produced, for example, by the rapid growth of the Habsburg Empire, which you can see here from the extent of it in the 1550s. Another factor would be the Reformation, which transforms and forges new connections across time and space, and there are various other factors that we can bring into this mix. It takes time across the 16th into the early 17th century for these practices to develop, but the decisive period, I think, is really from the 1660s to roughly 1720. This is the period when armed forces were established permanently across Europe, both land forces and naval forces. Of course, there had been permanent armies, but they were not internally structurally permanent. So the existence of permanent subunits within armies, the emergence of specially, specifically designed warships which could not be repurposed as merchantmen when they were not being used as warships and so forth. These are changes really that happened from the middle of the 17th century. From this point on, armies were permanent and they had to be maintained in peace as well as wartime. And it's also in this period that Aaron has shown that Britain switched from being a net exporter of what we might term fiscal military assets to the largest consumer of them. So what you can see on the slide here, these are all British and Irish. So let me get this in the right order. Yes, the man on the left in blue is English, the one in the centre is a Scot, and the one on the right is an Irish, and they are in Spanish service in around 1680. So they count as, by our definition, as foreign, because the King of Spain had no legal hold over these, unlike, for example, the Flemish troops that serve Spain, or most of the Italians which serve Spain, or the Burgundians and so forth. So, and it is really in this, this is on the cusp of the period where Britain stopped providing these troops to foreign powers and increasingly was in fact then incorporating them into its own forces. After about 1720, there were really no major innovations in terms of how this sort of business was done. Treaties increasingly refer to past practice, so again another one of Aaron's findings, because he went through the treaties that were concluded by Britain, those with Hessen-Kassel, which is one of the German troop providers, in the 1790s are referring to the 1702 treaty as the benchmark, and so there's a kind of repetition. People knew what they were doing, they would customize things for the moment, but there's no real major innovation, although the development of tradable state debt in the 1710s encouraged the spread of foreign investment, again, as Aaron was showing. The system facilitates all the major mid-18th century European wars, so between 1733 and 1763, which were waged by rival coalitions which relied heavily on foreign manpower and subsidies and loans. Some powers coped better than this than others, Britain coping better than, say, France. And Prussia's example, I think, underscores the point that Aaron was making about Britain, about how dependency on certain types of foreign resources had important domestic consequences. Prussia pursued the fallacy of striving for autarky to an extreme. So it literally had barrels of cash in the palace vaults stored up for the next war, and it was trying to be as self-sufficient as possible, and as a result it avoided making difficult choices, for example, not renegotiating the tax grants with its own subjects, and not changing its conscription system after 1733, but relying heavily on foreign recruits to expand its army. And when it had to fight a war on two fronts, which it did in the early 1790s, fighting both revolutionary France, for which it was being paid by the British, and at the same time fighting the Polish insurrection, it failed. It was bankrupt and it had to withdraw from the conflict. The zenith of the system, and also the onset of its demise, is from the time of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The large-scale protracted warfare after 1792 saw a peak of the activity, but it also contained things that were going to undermine it. The revolutionary ideology of the citizen in arms, which, as you can see, celebrated here in the painting, as well as the revolution's assault on social and geographical privileges, greatly expanded the state's reach into people's pockets and their command over their bodies as well. It reduced many of the legal barriers that had hindered the mobilization of domestic human and material resources. Simultaneously, the greater reach of the state was heightened by a nationalist ideology, the sovereignty of the nation. France, for example, was compelled to confront the question of, well, who is really a Frenchman? and once you invest sovereignty of the nation, you have to decide much more clearly and firmly and precisely who belongs to that nation. So that discouraged an initial reliance on foreigners, and it disbanded its foreign regiments in 1792, only swiftly to resume recruitment as due to the voracious demand for manpower. But French methods from the 1790s onwards were really conventionally imperial rather than those of the fiscal military system. It simply requisitioned resources or imposed them as tribute from defeated or allied states. By contrast, France's enemies, foremost among whom was Britain, relied heavily on the established pattern of fiscal military exchanges to sustain their successive coalitions. And it's Britain that ultimately ends by 1815 bankrolling the entire anti-French coalition. And to ensure the peace, what's often forgotten is that they make a whole slew of contracts in June of 1815, guaranteeing that they've got over 1 million foreign troops just in case there's a resumption of the war. The fate of the system after Napoleon's final defeat mirrors the Restoration era more generally. Many of the underlying structures remained in place, but the conditions had been profoundly altered. The most obvious was the demise of many of the semi-sovereign powers in the Vienna settlement of 1814 to 15, which consolidated both Germany and Italy into far fewer medium and small sovereign states. So many of the troop providers, in other words, had disappeared. The settlement, moreover, also articulated a much more coherent and modern form of neutrality, undermining the legitimacy of supplying war resources to belligerents by third parties. So in the past, the idea of what the Swiss could do of providing troops, so the Swiss had a complicated treaty system to supposedly to prevent their soldiers ever fighting each other, which didn't actually work. After 1815, there is a formal acknowledgement of Switzerland as neutral, and that's written in also when Belgium was created in 1839. So this idea of modern neutrality, of standing aside from a conflict, is something which, of course, delegitimizes much of this foreign service. Meanwhile, the widespread desire to enjoy a peace dividend encouraged the drastic military and naval reductions, leaving surplus manpower, arms and other material, and therefore removing the urgency of finding new methods of resource mobilization. Conscription remained in place, but it was in fact far from universal, leaving paradoxically the space for the continued use of foreigners, and both France and the Netherlands raised new units, as does the Kingdom of Naples when it's faced with internal unrest in the 1820s. So this is one of the Swiss regiments, new Swiss regiments that's raised by the Neapolitans. Nonetheless, the greater nationalisation of war-making resources during the revolutionary and Napoleonic era encouraged efforts after 1815 to prevent their export to potential enemies by curbing the so-called extraterritorial violence through measures such as prohibiting privateering and the enlistment in foreign armies. These efforts drew on practices, in fact, that were already inherent in the system, but repurposed them to suit this new agenda, to the agenda of monopolising manpower by curbing the previously what had been considered the right of men to emigrate and to serve foreign powers. So in pre-modernity, it's considered honourable to fight for a just cause elsewhere. Now you're being treasonous to your own country to do so. Initially, this was conceived in purely national terms, so each state operating on its own, trying to change its laws to control its own its own inhabitants are doing. But increasingly, it became obvious that this had to involve cooperation. So governments agreed, for example, to extradite deserters, implicitly renouncing the right then to recruit foreigners. And this is the origins, by the way, of the modern extradition treaty. Often these are expanded to include the extradition of criminals as well. And then under pressure from mercantile interests, Europe's great powers acted together in the Declaration of Paris in 1856 to ban privateering. Meanwhile, the renewed revolutionary upheavals of the 1830s and 1848 accelerated all of this by burnishing the credentials of the motivated citizen in arms against the foreign mercenary, who's seen increasingly as an agent of tyranny. So the Dutch disband their foreign regiments in 1829, partly in fact due to difficulties in recruiting them. The Swiss return those units, and that's in 1830 from the opening slide. And the revised Swiss Federal Constitution of 1848 ruled that there were to be no more foreign contracts. That dismantling is hastened then in the very last phase of this, various factors combining after 1849 to accelerate the dismantling of the system. One is Britain's withdrawal from that system after 1856, which reduced both the supply and the demand of resources. Simultaneously, the economies of continental European powers were increasingly able to supply capital to their own governments, as well as improve tax returns. Industrialization was boosting productivity and also offering the prospect of substituting machinery for labour power, making it easier to free manpower for warfare. Revised conscription laws from the 1870s progressively eliminated most of the remaining exemptions. They also replaced the ineffective National Guards with much more effective integrated systems of reservists, allowing armies to mobilise much more rapidly in wartime. So the kind of thing where what Britain was doing in the 18th century of basically around 50% or more of its initial wartime increase was simply to hire ready-made armed forces, especially from the German princes. Now this reservist system, which Britain of course doesn't adopt, but everyone else has by the end of the 19th century, enabled you to do the same from your own population. Meanwhile, overseas imperial expansion opened up access to new war-making assets, especially non-European military labour, which was employed to defend and extend colonies, and in France's case, already in the 1850s, to augment metropolitan forces in Europe. The processes of Italian and German unification removed the last remaining small powers like Naples, Sicily, and the Papal States. And what you can see here is one of the things about the ambiguities of all of this. So the man that you can see in the grey uniform is Peter Jong, who was a motivated Catholic volunteer serving from the Netherlands. So there's a special museum in the Netherlands dedicated to the Papal Zouaves, which was a Catholic volunteer force, but serving in the papal army, most of which were in fact foreigners because the Pope distrusted his own remaining subjects. And the people fighting them were also, many of them are foreigners. So the men in the red shirts are of course the Garibaldini. So you have the idea of the motivated foreign volunteer who's fighting for liberty, but when we look at this in terms of motivation, the ambiguities are there. When we look at it in terms of the legalities of this, the foreign regiments are being sort of delegitimised. After 1870, alliance warfare, of course, persisted, but resources were not exchanged or shared on the same scale until the Second World War, which revealed new limits, I would argue, to national sovereign war-making and a globalised international order. So, almost there at the end. Right. What about the global dimension of this, you might ask? And that would be a fair question. And very sadly, Aaron and I were co-writing an article which was going to try and address this. Unfortunately, I'm not sure what to do with that. And hopefully I will be able to return to it because I do have many of his ideas for it. But anyway, I'll try and give you my thoughts, such as they are at the moment. I would argue that war-making resources were largely produced, exchanged, and employed in Europe. Extra-European resources, with the exception, of course, of saltpeter, played only a minimal role in European warfare. External resources were important to European empire building, which was far from simply an overseas extension of the metropolitan fiscal military state. historians of imperialism have picked up on that fiscal military state argument and tried to sort of project it to look at, say, the French Empire or the British Empire, somehow this kind of global fiscal military state. I think that captures something of it, but the situation is, I would argue, a bit more complicated. Nor was empire building solely a process of mobilizing additional local resources. But even when you combine them, even within this sort of imperial version of the fiscal military state, the export of European war-making assets to global empires was far, far smaller than what was circulating within Europe itself. And I would argue that our findings reveal a difference between the first pre-modern phase of European imperialism and what followed during the 19th century. European-sourced assets were essential to the establishing, expanding and the sustaining of the European presence overseas, but they were much, much less significant to non-Europeans. People elsewhere in the world were perfectly able to fight each other without relying on European resources. That is the thing that changes in the 19th century. Conflicts in all parts of the globe become increasingly dependent on the wealth, the technologies and other assets either produced or controlled by European powers. Simultaneously, arms exports were much more closely aligned to power projection through licensing systems and through the development of military missions to train foreign forces, if you look at what happens in China and especially in Latin American countries. Right, very lastly then our conclusions. Europe's fiscal military system emerged to serve a specific function of facilitating the exchange of scarce war-making resources. The system's development was integral to that of Europe's evolution as a sovereign state system, since the components of that system needed reliable ways of interacting despite their suspicions and rivalries. The system declined as the growing nationalisation of warfare rendered it functionally redundant. Therefore, I would argue that it's unique to pre-modern Europe, and we don't claim to have invented another universal model such as, say, the military revolution that somehow can be transposed and used anywhere around the world. The era of fully nationalised modern warfare, I think, has proved historically brief, giving way around 1990, so the end of the Cold War, to what, dare I say it, we might call a postmodern, certainly post-national war-making, which is increasingly dependent on private military contractors and security companies, and in which armed non-state actors have assumed considerable importance. So what you can see there, this is a recruiting mural for the Wagner Group. The slogan is in Serbian, and it was subsequently graffitied out. So that was taken at the early stages of the Ukraine war. Contemporary conditions don't represent a return of the mercenary, as some people have argued, or a return indeed of any other pre-modern form, but nonetheless, I think an examination of the significance of early modern extraterritorial resource mobilization hopefully helps us to pose better questions about our present problems. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time now for some questions. Wow, and some eager hands have come up already. So let me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me start with David there, and then we'll go around. David.
Yes, I mean, central to your story, and it's a European story, is obviously the contractor state. There is a prehistory to this, and I was surprised that you didn't land on it straight away, which is the very important work, a pioneering book by Pepijn Brandon.
Yes.
Called War, Capital and the Dutch State. Because of the federal nature of the Dutch state, the admiralties, I suppose 5 of them were almost forced to rely on contracting. And the role of those contractors was extraordinary. They were able to mobilize urban resource, but also he reflects an awful lot on the political power that he gave to regional centres of influence.
Mhm.
It's a very special politics that arises from. So this is the prehistory, if not the early history, the beginnings of European contractor state. And I think it would be good to, to put that at the start of your narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely, I entirely agree. I mean, the contractor state both models, I think, have been extraordinarily helpful. I mean, Brewer's model, the fiscal military state, and obviously that he's not the first to talk about that. I mean, we can talk about Peter Dixon's contribution to that as well. I mean, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. And the contractor state model as well has been extraordinarily helpful. But I think our point is not that any of these are in themselves wrong, but they only look at one facet of the story. So the Dutch contracting, for example, most of what that study is about the contracting with the Dutch themselves. But the Dutch are structurally dependent on foreigners. They need foreigners for crewing the ships, for example, that the navies are putting out, and they definitely need foreigners for their armed force, and that is their also their surge capacity when the Dutch go to war. By the later 17th century, they immediately hire foreigners, and that's the quick way that you can defend the Dutch Republic itself, which of course the vulnerability of which has been exposed by the French invasion of 1672.
There's a question here.
Oh, hi. Fascinating talk. You mentioned, to my surprise, that Switzerland was earlier on a great exporter of manpower. Well, what happened after that outlet ceased? I mean, what did all those Swiss people who no longer fight for do? Is this when they started making cooking books?
Well, one of the things we need to remember is that you're not just continually exporting people. People come back. So quite a lot of the Swiss would serve for a few years and then would return. So a regiment might be permanent, but you as an individual would sign on for, say, 3 or 4 years. And if you were doing peacetime service, your survival chances are relatively good. And the Swiss also continue to serve, despite the fact that the federal constitution of 1848 bans it. The last surviving units are those in Naples, and there is a big dispute because the Swiss government say, well, you can no longer carry the Swiss flag, and the soldiers mutiny, and then they're dissolved. And then, lo and behold, the Neapolitan army has 3 foreign regiments who are, mainly the same personnel, because they've been in Naples for a very long time, a lot of them, and then they're also bulked out by Bavarians as well. But yeah, so some people are coming back. There is also the changes in the Swiss economy in the 19th century. One of the problems that had pushed people out were changes in the Swiss economy beforehand, which were say, animal husbandry, which was less labour intensive, and therefore it created a group of people who were before the age where they would normally marry and become a householder, and they're the ones that usually go abroad, and some of them would make enough money to come back. And those who didn't come back, of course, well, sometimes their relations would actually inherit. The Swiss treaties were the most sophisticated at also ensuring that discharged soldiers got pensions. So at the point in the 19th century, they are actually being honoured. In the 17th century, Louis XIV is always defaulting.
I was fascinating talk. I was very intrigued by your comments about gunpowder, and it made me think of a couple of examples in other wars where belligerents thought if we can stop the enemy getting certain supplies, we'll end the war that way. One example is the armed neutrality of the North starving Great Britain of naval resources.
Yeah.
Another is depriving Germany of heavy water or ball bearings
Yeah.
in the Second World War.
Yeah.
Did anybody, to your knowledge, ever think if we can stop the enemy getting gunpowder, we'll win the war that way alone with minimal casualties?
Yeah, I mean, this remains, and also I'm very conscious there's somebody in the room who knows far more about saltpeter than I do. I'm not really probably the best person to answer this. But what I would say, it is surprising actually that no one really ever runs out. No one makes peace because they run out of ammunition. But there are certainly, it's a hindrance. It's extraordinarily expensive to besiege a city, for example, because you expend so much gunpowder, and the difficulty of stockpiling it and things like that. Naval stores is a much more obvious one. Yes, the various leagues of armed neutrality and the attempts to blockade the Sound and so on, and then particularly by the already by the during the War of Spanish Succession, the British are trying to find substitutes, and repeatedly every time there is a war where access to the Baltic across the 18th century becomes disrupted, they continue to look at substitutes, but they never find anything that is as good as, for example, the timber. So North American timber is deemed not so good. Hemp from the Black Sea or India is not as good. It's like a seventh as strong as the hemp that you can make from the Russian version. So these sort of substitution efforts that don't really succeed.
I'm just interested, particularly with this last exchange, that surely we're seeing some of this now, because much of the discussion, for example, in the context of Iran and also Ukraine, is how the kind of certainly more technological weapons are incredibly expensive, and the aim is to deny the enemy these. Certainly, the Americans have tried to deny access to key chips and things like this, and much of it. I'm also intrigued the idea that. You say that there aren't these mercenary groups, or we don't have treaties anymore. Well, we've just raised a regiment of Gurkhas.
Yes.
So we still do this if it's convenient.
Yeah. Well, the UK, along with the US and France, are not signatories to the UN Anti-Mercenary Convention, which hasn't really, because not enough countries have ratified it. It's a dead letter. The only things that regulate this is the Montreux document, which was something brokered by the Swiss government in 2008, and there is another sort of industry-based code of conduct, but these things have largely gone out of the window, especially as Chinese and other companies increasingly dominate the market. So while it was still sort of Western predominantly in the early 2000s, there was probably a greater willingness for this, but it wasn't very effective then, and it's even less effective now.
I'd like to know a little bit more about the Baltic stuff, particularly the eastern Baltic, because when you were saying that you were considering Hamburg as a case study, I was wondering about St. Petersburg, and also the role of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in terms of provisions of Ukraine. So I just wondered if you could sort of flesh that sort of dimension of the project out a little bit more.
Yeah, so in terms of which cities we look at and things like that, our choice of cities were basically where you would go to do business by and large, not necessarily with the government that controlled that city. So some are these autonomous republics, so Genoa and Geneva being the best examples. Hamburg would also fit into that kind of category. So political capitals are not necessarily, so for example, no one went to St. Petersburg to do business with anyone else other than the Russians. Whereas you go to Danzig or Gdansk, definitely. And so, for example, when the French are financing the Hungarian rebels against the Austrians in the early 18th century, the money is being channeled through Gdansk with a Polish noblewoman, in fact, playing an important part in remitting the money. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is a supplier of saltpeter as well as grain. It's a major player in terms of producing, and to some extent it was a troop provider in the early 17th century. So anyone who knows sort of Rembrandt's painting of a so-called Cossack, this is one of the Polish light cavalrymen, which is who's hired by or paid by the Habsburgs in the 30 Years' War. So yeah, it's definitely it's very much part of the system in this way. And again, contracting, a lot of the contractors who are involved in Poland, who help, for example, to supply the Russians when the Russians are engaged in the 7 Years' War, but also particularly who are involved in contracting in the Napoleonic Wars. So we tend to think, Napoleon, the army marches on its stomach, we're just going to requisition everything, where in fact they also use contractors. And these are Jewish families who have emigrated eastwards from families who are connected in Amsterdam and are taking business practices with them and are using that for establishing, quite serious transportation and logistics businesses in Poland.
Oh, sorry, Zane.
Thanks, Peter. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the historiographical implications of your research. You talked about the fiscal state and contractor state models, right? But those are two literatures that are embedded in much bigger discussions about great divergence, right? Or like Carmel Polanyi, the comparative advantage of violence. Now we're talking about markets, which are much better at reallocating resources efficiently. I'm curious what questions this research has raised for you and how your judgment of other literatures has changed as a consequence of it.
Good question. As I say, I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring together various bits and pieces that have been looked at largely separately. And one of the problems, I think, is that the literature is very much national focused. I mean, there's, for example, there's phenomenal work that's done on the Spanish contractors, but it's focused through the lens of Spanish history. And so not only do we get the benefits of comparative history, how is Spanish contracting different from, say, French contracting, or what difference, can we detect? But it's when we begin to think about, well, let's look at the fact that none of these countries, none of these polities are self-sufficient. So we got borrowing from abroad. Well, the obvious one is the French influence in Spain that comes in, and that's through an alliance, of course. But equally, the Spanish are, hiring large numbers of foreign troops, and they're also at different times requiring other resources that come from abroad. And it's only when you put all of these pieces together that I think we can fully understand it, and that's what we were trying to do. Yeah.
I'm going to finish with one question for myself, because you've really focused on the kind of way that the state benefits from this and the state's demand. I wondered about the entrepreneurial side of this, which is the counterpart, I guess. Yeah. And is that itself something where you're seeing shifts in how the entrepreneurs are working, how well integrated they are? I mean, to end with the Wagner Group, right? It's an integrated military firm. Is there something like that happening, or is this actually a rather stable kind of set of solutions that states are accessing roughly the same way over this period, maybe in different scale, but still roughly the same structure?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, on the one hand, it's amazing how people didn't learn, so they repeatedly make the same mistakes. So they will sign a contract that is full of so many loopholes that, that if they'd only read some of the other contracts, and it's also, there's a lot of this information is publicised. So it's extraordinary how much that we would consider to be, state secrets is in the public domain at the time. And that's also part of what we've been looking at. So yeah, there's a certain stability of this. There's also, I think, certain stability that is imposed by social and cultural norms. So the fact that a lot of these people who are in this so-called business are actually looking for social and cultural rewards rather than the purely financial ones, and that is the compensation for the fact that they invariably don't get paid or don't get paid in full, or nearly always. But yeah, and looking at the individuals, I mean we've got sort of all sorts of fascinating stories of people who engage with this successfully, people who do this as a ladder to develop a sort of bigger business, and people who fail catastrophically.
Failing catastrophically sounds and I was going to give you please.
Yeah.
These countries in Europe that had a web of treaties and contracts for 100 years cooperating, and then the system declined. Do you think that there was much institutional memory of that cooperation and those relationships, or did it all get forgotten?
Well, I think in the 19th century it is sort of partly forgotten and partly also deliberately denigrated. I mean, it is delegitimized. You are, the use of the term, I've deliberately not used the term mercenary. I mean, the mercenary is an ahistorical term. But it's a term which is sort of heavily loaded, and if you, from being a what I would term as a foreign soldier, because it's a more neutral term, so you could be, quite honourable, like Robert Monroe, the author of like the first sort of published regimental history in Britain. Joins a Scottish regiment that is raised to fight for the Danes. The regiment gets transferred, he fights for the Swedes, he comes back and he serves in the British Civil Wars, he publishes his account, and he sees himself as a man of God. He's serving the Protestant cause, he's serving the Stuart cause. The Danes are of course related to the Stuarts. This is entirely honourable. The idea that you would write about yourself in that way or be seen in that way in the 19th century is much more problematic. So you can be, an ideologically motivated foreign volunteer like one of the Garibaldini, but it's very interesting that outside the very narrow kind of Catholic view, and there are, even today some popular accounts that talk about them being Catholic crusaders. The people the Garibaldini are fighting are seen as, the foreign mercenaries, henchmen of, evil tyranny, and that is the kind of language. You serve your own country, and that's the honourable thing to do. And if you go off and do anything else, it's bad behaviour.
We're now going to now invite Aaron's father to come up and offer a final few words, and so I offer a vote of thanks very much for this work.
Yeah.
So please.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I learned from Aaron and from my own career that it's never a good idea to talk too long in between the end of a session and the reception. So I'm going to be very brief, and I'm talking today on behalf of myself, my wife Sharon, my son Josh, Aaron's brother, and Josh's wife Emma, and on behalf of all of you, I'd like to thank Peter for his extremely interesting and eloquent presentations. I have to say I was particularly grateful for the way in which you recalled Aaron's contributions, because I recall many conversations over dinner at home where Aaron would be talk about the research he was doing and what he was working on. And it's only really now, having seen it all put together, that I've understood all the various collaborations he had and who he worked with and how it all fit together. So I'm personally very grateful, and it was extremely useful, I think, to hear how the whole project fits together in that way. So thank you very much for that. I'm really grateful for that. I'd also like to thank Peter on behalf of my family. He mentioned the article that was published that Aaron wrote setting out his central hypothesis that was published in the English Historical Review this year, which I understand is a very prestigious publication. And although Peter didn't mention it, I'd like to thank him because he put an awful lot of work in turning Aaron's final draft into the version for publication. And as a non-academic, I didn't appreciate just how much work is involved in doing that. So I'm particularly grateful to you, Peter, for seeing that through. So that ensured that Aaron's work did see the light of day and his central hypothesis was seen and shared with the academic community.
Antonio mentioned also that there are some representatives here today from Aaron's old school, Haberdashers, and I'd like to join Antonio in welcoming them here today. We're particularly grateful to Haberdashers for Aaron's education there, because it was there that he discovered his passion for history. And I say that with some apology, because his old English teacher is in the audience. But he discovered his passion for history there, and it was there that he decided that he was going to pursue an academic career. And there was never any shaking him from that. He was always determined that that was going to be his destiny. And I always say to people that you can only ever hope for two things from your children, which is that they discover and they know what they want to do. And if you're very, very lucky, they'll be good at it. And I have to say that in relation to both Aaron and his brother Josh, we were blessed with both of them. And I thank Haberdashers for that in many respects, because Josh also went to Haberdashers. And on a personal note, as did I, and I would say on a personal level that I'm delighted to see in the audience not only a contemporary from my own year at Haberdashers, but also one of my old teachers in the audience, who taught me, believe it or not, economic history. And I'd like to say to Lawrence and Dr. Wigley that through these glasses we haven't changed a bit. I say that because Lawrence and I left over 50 years ago. But moving on, I'd just like to thank, I'm sorry, there's a lot of thank yous in this. I'd like to thank Antonio and the History Department at UCL. I'd like to thank the English Historical Society for supporting these events. I'd like to thank all of you for coming along this evening and supporting this series of lectures. It means an awful lot to all of my family that Aaron's academic contribution is recognised and remembered in this way. And we do understand, although we're not part of the academic world, that this is a great accolade that you have given Aaron. And we are very grateful to that, because we take immense pride in all his contributions. And this sort of event keeps his academic legacy alive. So we're very grateful to all of you for supporting the event, to Peter for coming along today for your presentation, and to all of you for coming along this evening. So thank you very much, and we'll have a chance to catch up, I hope, over the reception. So thank you very much.